Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everyone. So I'm online, and then our speaker, Dr. Dillon Shaver from Argonne National Lab, is online as well. We hoped to do in person, but the laboratory changed the rules barely a week or two ago, so I think it was too short of a notice to try to book the flights and everything. But yeah, it's my real pleasure to virtually host Dr. Shaver at North Carolina State University Nuclear Engineering Program. So Dr. Shaver is a principal engineer in the Nuclear Science and Engineering Division at Argonne National Laboratory. He's a development lead for the NEC 5000 and the US DOE Nuclear Energy Advanced Modeling and Simulation, a NEAMS program, and has significant experience with model development, implementation, and validation in NEC 5000. He currently serves as an assistant technical program committee chair for the thermohydraulic division for ANS, and actually stepping up to the program chair starting this summer. And in 2020, he won the Moody Award from the Fluids Engineering Division of American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And he holds a PhD in nuclear engineering and science obtained from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in 2014. So I had the pleasure to overlap a little bit with him over at RPI when I was doing a postdoc, and with Professor Podolsky, and Dillon was doing his PhD over there. So it's always a pleasure to interact with Dillon. So Dillon, please go ahead with your talk.
Thank you, Professor Bolotnov, for that kind introduction. As you mentioned, we've been working together for quite a while, and it's good to continue that collaboration. So today I'm going to talk to everyone at NCSU about some CFD activities in the Department of Energy's NEAMS program. This is effectively everything I've been working on for the last, I suppose 7 years that I've been at Argonne. Imagine how time flies. So before I get started, I just want to state that this is, by no means is this all my work. This is the result of a collaborative effort by quite a few individuals. And the last few years, we are happy to also include a couple of NCSU alumni from Igor's program with us. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the outline of my talk today, so before we get too much into this, I want to introduce the NEC 5000 and NEC RS computational fluid dynamics codes that we develop at Argonne in conjunction with Paul Fisher at UIUC. And for background on that, I'll have to talk a little bit about the spectral element method and share the capabilities of the code. And then quite a bit of what I'll be focusing on here today has been in benchmarking and validation activities, particularly in reference to experimental validation, as well as a couple other projects of interest. And then I'll share some concluding remarks. So a little background on the spectral element method. First, an overview of NEC 5000 and NEC RS. So part of NEAMS is advanced modeling. So to do advanced modeling, that means getting the right answer. Otherwise, what are we bothering with? And to do that, you have to get a range of physical scales, or these turbulent eddies, that have to be captured when you're talking about fluid dynamics. So we strive to be as close to first principles as possible. Now, in general, for CFD, you're talking about a multi-scale or multi-resolution simulation hierarchy, and we like to show this inverted pyramid. It'd be really nice if this pyramid weren't inverted, but the practical nature of things means DNS tends to be the smallest volume of simulations done. But that follows along this increased costs to decrease modeling hierarchy that we show here. So at the top or at the bottom, depending on your perspective, is these lump system parameter codes, and that's the real workhorse of design methods in industry, along with some sub-channel models, because these things run really quickly and you can do a lot of iterations with them. Now, getting into CFD, you're really talking about RANS, LES, DNS, and those are Reynolds average Navier-Stokes, large eddy simulation, direct numerical simulation, and these are just different models of dealing with turbulence. I say just, that belies the complexity that underlies all of these things. And as mentioned, RANS is your sort of introductory CFD that's going to give you smoothed time average results. LES and DNS are going to capture all of the instantaneous fluctuations. And with that is all of the overhead that comes with that, including much finer meshes, much higher resolution. And if you've got something really complicated, you might want to pay that price for it. So that's where NEC 5000 comes in. NEC is a highly scalable and efficient spectral element code. A little bit more about spectral elements in just a moment. But it scales on everything from a single core on your laptop to 1 million plus cores. These numbers are from the days of CPU computing now. In the days of GPUs, it's even higher than that. I don't even know the number anymore. But we're fully leveraging the entire range of DOE's computing resources. So before I talk about the spectral element method, we have to talk a little bit about turbulence. And in turbulence, you have this energy cascade from the inertial range all the way down to the dissipative range. So energy will cascade down these large-scale flow features, starting with the largest eddies and the smaller ones eventually down to the point where it dissipates due to viscosity. The largest features are what are going to have to be resolved by all of your CFD methods. So this includes RANs. So anything like you can imagine a vortex shedding off of a cylinder. That would be a large scale feature that has to be resolved. And that's going to be captured by your RANS models and everything beyond. LES methods try to resolve into, usually the Taylor microscale is a good place to talk about that. But this all depends on the method you're using, the resolution you've got, what you're doing in particular will dictate how far down you resolve. In DNS, to really call it DNS, you have to make sure you've got all of the little flow features. And as some of you may know, as your Reynolds number increases, the required resolution just becomes rather extreme. So when you're talking about these very small scales, controlling your numerical error becomes important. So we're talking about these very low wave numbers. So that's where the spectral element method comes in. We say, why high order? So the spectral element method is like the finite element method, but we're using GLL quadrature, and we generally use much higher orders. So in this case, it's gives you the speed of spectral methods combined with the flexibility of finite element methods. And in this formulation, we have the domain that's partitioned into E as a number, high order hexahedral elements. In 2D, these would be quadrilaterals. And then the trial and test functions are represented on these elements as these nth order tensor product polynomials. So that gives us E times n cubed degrees of freedom, or E times n squared in 2D. And our typical target is between 5th and 11th order. Really, the sweet spot is right around 7th order. This just tends to be an artifact of practice. You know, this is what we observed it for. And the advantage to doing it this way is your solution converges exponentially fast in space with n for smooth solutions. So this is usually called a p-type refinement study. Rather than increasing the number of elements, we just increase our spatial approximation order. So as an example, I'm showing a mesh on the left, which is a 7th order mesh. This is our typical running point. For this particular case, we were doing LES, and I had to push it all the way up to 13th order until my statistics converged. So why high order? When you run these spectral methods, they have a couple of really nice properties. Particularly the dispersion errors are really reduced on a high order mesh. So as an example here, we're showing this non-smooth test cone. It's really just a pointed cone. And it undergoes a full rotation in space on this grid. So all 4 of the meshes have the same number of degrees of freedom, but they're represented on different element numbers n, with different different element numbers k at different spectral orders represented by n. So at the lower order, you can see you've got all of these dispersion errors that come out as part of in the process of finding the solution. But as you increase that, you know, again, you're not increasing your degrees of freedom, but you're getting much better dealing with the dispersion errors, much better resolution effectively of your problem. And another important part of this is that spectral methods are also, they're practically free of numerical diffusion, which can be quite important when simulating high Reynolds numbers. You know, if you approach these with some of the other methods, such as a finite volume method, you might end up where your numerical diffusion is just as important as your actual viscous diffusion. And then it becomes a question of, well, what are you actually simulating at that point? So I mentioned a little bit about it. Finite volume methods. So This is a test that we like to show mostly because this test was not done by anyone with an affiliation at Argonne. This was done by someone at NREL. Mike Sprague was his name back in 2010, and he compared the error that you get out of NEC 5000 for the same simulation between NEC 5000 and open foam. So this was just, I think it was just simple channel flow. And they're showing the results that you get for, right here's the RMS error in velocity for NEC 5000 versus open foam as a function of the degrees of freedom across the channel. So for any particular level of error that you want to get in open foam, you're going to need about twice as many grid points. We do even better for turbulence. So that's what's shown here, the RMS error for the fluctuating components. In general, NEC 5000 does much better compared to a finite volume method for the same degrees of freedom. And you can see what those turbulent kinetic energy profiles look like between the two codes that you get out. And it's kind of interesting that even for the low resolution case in NEC, you're already pretty much nailing the turbulent kinetic energy profile. Whereas in open foam, you still need quite a bit of refinement to get there. So hopefully I've convinced you that the spectral element method is worth it. But now what does NEC 5000 actually do? Well, we solve the conservation of mass, momentum, and energy equations on an unstructured mesh of high order curvilinear hexahedral elements. I've made most of these points already, but these are the governing equations that we use. At this point, anyone familiar with CFD shouldn't see anything particularly controversial here, but one thing to point out is that we do include buoyancy with a low Mach number approach. Could also use a Boussinesq model as well. That's actually simpler than this. But there is effectively, as long as there are no compressibility effects, we can model it pretty well. Again, worth mentioning is we recently have included RANS models through basically the K omega family of models, and that would come in here with an effective viscosity. All right. So now getting into the capabilities of NEC 5000 and NEC RS. So NEC 5000 was originally developed for DNS and LES approaches. This is our bread and butter. If you're interested in NEC 5000, this is probably what you want to do. And this capability has been well established now over the course of, the code is actually 2 weeks older than I am, so it's been quite a while. And our LES model is based on a filtering approach, so it is an explicit filter. So what that means is that unresolved wavelengths are filtered out at every single time step. So at the end of each solution, we are effectively rebuilding our solution on the Legendre basis and reconstructing it from each order, and we weight. We apply a weighting factor to the highest orders, and we pull the energy out of those shortest wavelengths. So what this means is usually our filter is specified to touch, say, the highest two modes. So then when we employ this p-type refinement strategy, that pushes that filter to higher and higher frequencies or shorter and shorter wavelengths until effectively it no longer impacts our solution. Generally, what we're looking for is once we get it to the point where the filter is only acting in a region where the turbulent features are homogeneous, then that's effectively giving us the answer that we're looking for. As a demonstration, the case that I'm showing here is for LES of a 217 pin bundle. This was done 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer at this point. At the time, this was considered a hero class calculation. This is only a single pitch. One of the first, actually the first NEC 5000 case that reached 1 billion degrees of freedom. This particular mesh is is about 3 million elements at 7th order. At the moment now, this is effectively a Tuesday calculation. This is no big deal for us these days. What is a big deal now, and we're talking about computational scalability, is things have advanced to the point now where when we're doing these hero class calculations, they're effectively full core simulations. So there's 2 examples here that we're showing. The one above is actually a RANS model for a small modular reactor, and this is based on the new scale design. So this includes the effect of mixing vanes, which are not, they're not explicitly modeled here. They're used or they're not explicitly meshed here. We use a momentum source model to account for that effect. But you can see all of the assemblies we're resolving down to a pin level. We have every single pin, and you can see in the top right is the impact of the mixing vanes. So these are the sort of the transverse flow patterns that are induced by that. Below is the simulations for pebble bed reactors. We spent quite a bit of time developing this. We've got effectively an in-house meshing capability that's based on Voronoi cells that it's almost to the point where push button receive mesh. But we were able to push this all the way to, at this point, it's a full core simulation. There's 350,000 pebbles there. Every single one of them is fully resolved. We got the Reynolds numbers at this point are about 7,000. And we deploy these simulations. We simulate them on Argonne Leadership Computing Facility and Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facility. So that means Theta and Summit, and hopefully in the near future, eventually Aurora. But kind of the amazing thing about this is you can do an entire convective time for this LES simulation of the pebble beds in just a couple of hours. So we're very close to, I dare say, real-time simulation of these things. So it's quite an exciting time to start seeing, rather than being left in the realm of assembly level and pin level calculations, now we're really approaching full core, which has quite a bit of implications when you're talking about doing coupled simulations with neutronics. So a few more capabilities are the available RANS models. So this has been a recent push based on user feedback. As I mentioned, the workhorse in industry is lower order, tends to be lower order models. So that's what makes VRANS attractive. And we've implemented a couple of models from the K Omega family. We did fully wall resolved models in the last year or so. And recently we've been testing an implementation of the wall functions. And hopefully eventually we'll get to a steady solver as well. Just as an example of what was done with this was a simulation for flow through an axial neutron reflector design. This particular work was done for the versatile test reactor. Here we use the standard K Omega model, and our Reynolds number for this case was 900,000. So to do this with LES would have been practically impossible to get a Reynolds number that high. So getting into some of the multi-physics capabilities, this was some work that was done a while ago for flow-induced vibration. So we're fully coupled NEC 5000 with a solid mechanics code. That's Diablo out of Lawrence Livermore. So the flow outside of this helical coil heat exchanger was simulated with NEC 5000. We couple it to Diablo, and it predicts the vibrations in these helical coils. And this coupled code was benchmarked against the legacy experimental results, and we found that we got pretty good comparison for the spectral frequency of the vibrations as well as the amplitude of those vibrations. And it's worth noting that what's being shown here is exaggerated, so the actual vibrations are not quite this severe. This is just for the purpose of simulation or the purpose of visualization. Moving on. We also have the capability for multi-phase flows. So this was some work done a couple of years ago, also as part of the helical coil project that I was shown on the last slide. This was for the heat exchanger is actually a steam generator. So we have this multi-phase capability. It's currently in development with NEC 2P. So NEC 2P is a usual two-fluid model solver. So the model that we've implemented has a common pressure for both fields. Fully incorporates boiling and interfacial interactions, and we applied this to the boiling flow in that helical coil steam generator that I showed previously. And you can see these are cross-sectional profiles of the volume fraction along the helical coil. So as you come in, it doesn't start boiling until you get about halfway along it, and then you can see it starts to form in the top right. And as you move progressively along the coil, the steam fraction increases steadily, and you get this kind of crescent-shaped pattern that develops. This is there's two competing forces in this, and that's the the separation from gravity, which is pulling all the liquid to the bottom. And there's also a centripetal effect that is pushing all of the liquid to the outside of the coil. So continuing in multi-physics, there's currently quite a bit of work in developing a thermal striping capability. We call this, this is done in conjunction with MOOS. So our fully coupled code is, we're calling it Cardinal. It's effectively just a wrapper around NEC 5000 or NEC RS that allows it to interface with MOOS. So we do the fluid calculation to predict the temperature with NEC 5000. It passes all of that information into MOOS, which includes a structural mechanics component, and from that we can get the strain rate. So this particular example is a very simplified case of just a jet interaction on a plate. We're currently working on applying this to a cold lag reflood event in an LWR pressure vessel. So getting into experimental validation, there's been, as I've mentioned, there's been quite a bit of work over the years in validating the code. So this first example is for thermal mixing in a T-junction, and this is particularly important when you're talking about thermal striping. So as these hot and cold legs mix, they shed these vortices that come downstream, and as they interact with effectively the welded junction between these, you can get thermal striping in that vicinity. And depending on the severity of that, there can be quite a few implications for your reactor design for that. So this particular benchmark was sponsored by the OECD, NEA, and it was a blind benchmark. You can see the conditions are given here. They provided us with the inlet profiles, and there were 29 total entries, and we placed first in terms of temperature prediction. Also worth mentioning that we took 6th in velocity, but all of the top scores for velocity were quite close. And just to show you what that looks like, so these are a few more results where we did not only the LES simulation, but also the URAN simulation with our newly implemented models. And as expected, LES is the blue line here, and the circles are the experimental data. The LES produces the most consistent results. That should be no surprise. It has the least amount of modeling. It's the closest to first principles that we can get. We also saw reasonable agreement with URANs. There's quite a few differences, especially in the regions where the mixing is significant. But depending on what you're looking for out of your simulation, we expected it to be different, and the agreement we get is relatively reasonable. But what comes with that is a significant savings in computational costs. So there's about an order of magnitude difference in the cost between these two simulations. So moving on, there's another example of some experimental validation, and this was done for the MADIS blind benchmark held by Carey. And this was a simulation of a 5x5 rod bundle with these swirl type mixing vanes. And you get quite an interesting turbulent pattern out of this. So you can see it's coming in, it's relatively smooth, and then it hits the mixing vanes in, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it hits the mixing vanes between these two planes, and it just induces quite a bit of turbulence in there. So the main takeaway here was that NEC 5000 ranked first in the RMS velocity. And then we can show, we have comparisons to some of the other codes. Unfortunately, we do not have the experimental data. I very much wish that we did. That would make the impact of this a lot more, that would make this a lot more impactful. But you can see that the difference between the two codes. So the average axial velocity NEC is the red line, and between all of these other different codes, you can see Cabaret, Convec 3D, Star CCM. You get quite a bit of differences here. But then for the RMS velocity, which is effectively a measure of your turbulence, where we did the best, you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between the different codes. Some of them not even close, not even qualitatively close. So we do pretty well on turbulence, which is really what we're targeting to do. We want to be able to say that we can resolve turbulence and we can handle it very well. So moving on to some other aspects. Of course, I'm going to talk about this work. This was done for these twisted tube heat exchangers. Work was instituted by Kairos Power. They are interested in using these because they're a molten salt reactor, so they need to get the best possible heat transfer coefficients they can out of a small, as compacted design as possible. So in this work, we were evaluating the friction factor and the Nusselt numbers for flow around these twisted tubes for molten salts. You can see that the results on the right are above is the instantaneous velocity field for the 7-tube bundle. On the bottom is the instantaneous temperature defect, which is effectively a deviation from the mean temperature, with a quarter of the domain's been removed so you can see the details. And you get these nice regions where the tubes are very close in contact, so it slows everything down, and you get some nice shedding behavior behind that. As also part of this, we did some investigations of the internal heat transfer as well, and you can see that in the video there where we're simulating, that's the velocity magnitude. And this was awarded the Lewis F. Moody Award by ASME for outstanding contribution to the field of mechanical engineering. So what they were really interested in for this work was there are some old correlations that come out of Russia, I think in either the 50s or 60s is when these were developed. And they suspected that even within the published range of applicability for these correlations, there were some discrepancies. So they contracted us to do this work where we took a look at that range that they were interested in. But before you can make any broad conclusions about your LES simulations being different from published experimental results, you have to know, or you have to have a lot of confidence in that. So we validated this by comparing to a more recent set of experimental data. This came out of, I believe this came out of Korea in 2013, where they have quite a bit of data across a range of Reynolds numbers for, they're very close to the range of parameters we're interested in. They published this correlation for their data, and we picked a couple of typical Reynolds numbers, and you can see that data plotted here on the chart to the right, and we just nailed it. The results we got from NEC were within 6% of the correlation for the heat transfer coefficient. So with this in hand, we have really good evidence that the method is working, doing exactly what we want it to do. So we had a lot more confidence in those uncovering those discrepancies in those other correlations, and we confirmed that they do in fact exist. Once you get out of once you start approaching the edge of viability for those correlations, there was quite a bit of difference, sometimes up to 50 or 60% off from what we expected. So they took this in hand and they went and they I think they've done their own experimental campaign to confirm that. But we just sort of set them off on the right path for that. So this is some of the more recent work that's being done now. This is part of the Advanced Reactors Test Program. So this is a 61-pin assembly with blockages. This has come up rather recently in the design of sodium fast reactors, that because these pin bundles are so tightly packed, if any debris gets in there, it may cause blockages in the subchannels. And they want to be able to quantify just what that's going to do in terms of the heat transfer as well as the pressure drop. So the experimental data was taken from, the experiments were done at Texas A&M, and they have been published rather recently. And there's been quite a bit of CFD comparisons done for this data using RANS models and Reynolds stress models. But to our knowledge, we're the first to use a more high fidelity capability for this. So we're using the LES models in NECRS. And you can see in the plot, the NECRS results are the red data points. The experimental data is the blue ones. And we're getting really quite good agreement between these two. So this is an ongoing set of work. We'll explore a couple of other different blockage configurations and start looking more closely at the turbulent impacts of this. All right, so now we'll get into a couple of other projects where these were, the ones we previously talked about were focused more on experimental validation. So these were just some of the projects we used for a pure CFD exploratory sort of campaign. And a lot of this was done for the VTR. I showed previously the axial neutron reflector design that they were interested in investigating. So they had 3 proposed designs, and the purpose of this reflector is to prevent neutrons from leaking out of the core. So you can't have a clear line of sight, a visual line of sight out of the core, either axially or radially, and you need to shield it. So these designs incorporate a twist in it, or some sort of effectively a flow blockage. You know, that in blocking the line of sight means you have to block off the flow. So they want to have a good measure of how that's going to impact their pressure drop. And as part of that, they also had questions about gamma heating. So we used the conjugate heat transfer model in NEC, where we predicted the temperatures in these axial neutron reflectors, and you can see the temperature predicted here. So the top of this is closer to the core. That's where the hottest temperature is, at the top of this reflector. And they provided us with a profile heat generation rate. This came from their neutronics calculations. And the end result of this is that the temperatures predicted in the steel were well below their thermal limits. So as a result of this, they basically decided they're not going to worry about their thermal limits in these components anymore. Also worth mentioning that some of the other designs were tested. This one actually performed pretty much the worst in terms of pressure drop, so they didn't go with this in the end. But it turns out that sodium is actually pretty good at heat transfer. Who knew? So this is a little more work for the VTR. They were quite concerned about their pressure margins. So this was for the reflector to fuel transition. So you can see on the left there that the piece on the bottom is the reflector design that they eventually went with, or intended to go with, I suppose. And we simulated the fluid flow through this transition using LES. So the Reynolds number that we simulated was lower than the design one, around 20,000. We did that just to make it so that this calculation was tractable. Some of the statistics on what we used there: 4.3 million elements. This was done a couple of years ago. That was relatively large at the time. Nowadays, that's pretty ordinary. Run on Mira. Mira has since been retired. Now we're running on Summit. And we got pressure distributions along this transition from the time average results. So this is the full 217 pin assembly. We omitted the wire wraps because we decided that they were downstream. They would needlessly complicate the problem. So we just sort of made that simplification. And then you can look at some of the results we got. So we're showing the pressure distribution on the left, the velocity distribution on the right along that midplane. So you can see the top of the reflector on the left, all of the support plates, and then some of the fuel pins in the cross section here. So sort of an interesting thing came out of these results, and I'll go back just a second. There are 3 holes in this reflector. There's one, if you can see the cursor here, there's one on this side and there's one opposite of this. And they sort of align along the direction of these, the support plates. So what ended up happening is the flow would come up out of those 2 holes. They would align in the support plates. They would flow. They would be obstructed by the pins, and then they would end up flowing down. So this is actually a region, this large green region in the figure on the right is actually a region of downflow, where it's coming, effectively being reflected by the pins and pushed back down. So this was sort of, they didn't expect to see this right off the bat. So showing them this kind of influenced their design choices down the road. And they made some changes and sort of took account for that. So when we got the results for 20,000, we make the assumption that the loss coefficients are effectively independent of Reynolds number, and we can predict kind of what you would expect the pressure drop to be at their design flow rate. So that's what the result of this is, and that gave them a pretty good idea of what their actual pressure margins are on this. One thing that I took away from this was one of my the first analyses that I did that was really into this high fidelity range, and you run all of these calculations. You generate terabytes and terabytes of data, and what you really care about comes out to be a line plot. So that's really what's the most useful. It breaks down the data in a useful way that they can use to make decisions. So another little bit of work that we're doing, this is an ongoing project for the NRC, and they're interested in running these simulations of this hydrogen mitigation experiment. So one of the problems that emerged from Fukushima was the development of hydrogen layers in their containment. As you can imagine, that sort of leads to a couple of issues. Explosion risk comes to mind. So they want to know what the behavior of these stratification layers is going to look like. So this is an ongoing computational campaign where they're doing an experimental benchmark at the same time. And this is effectively a jet interaction in a large tank, which you really need a high fidelity capability to do this accurately. The only problem is that this is a long running transient, so the computational time does not exist to do the full problem. So we're running into these issues of we can do sort of instance in that transient, but it'll be quite a while before we can capture the whole thing. But what they're really interested in is when you have this air jet that impinges on the stratified layers, how does that erode those layers, and what are the what's the overall behavior there? So we do quite a bit of this work. We try and do support across the industry, for the regulator, for other DOE programs as much as we can. And there's been quite a few interesting programs or interesting results that have come out of that. So a couple of concluding remarks. At this point, hopefully I have convinced you that NEC 5000 is a great CFD tool to use. Why would you want to use that? Well, you get high order accuracy at low cost being, of course, relative. I should say good cost for what you're getting out of it. It has extremely rapid exponential convergence in space. That's a product of the spectral element method. We can go up to third order accurate in time. Usually we run around 2 order or second order. And it's highly scalable. So this is a result of a fast scalable multi-grid solver. We've demonstrated it over 1 million MPI ranks. Now this goes beyond with NEC RS and GPUs. It's been extensively tested, tens of platforms for nearly 35 years. Now it's over 35 years. Just a huge base of journal articles that have been written, a larger and expanding worldwide user base. It's open source, so we don't really track that, but we have estimates that there are quite a few users all over the place. For each test, or for each build, we have 400 tests that make sure the source is verified. And one of the more attractive things about this is we're looking at a pathway towards NQA1. This is really being driven by the NRC's demand on this, as well as some recent work for the ARDP awards. They're really looking for something that they can use to generate qualified results. As far as benchmarking and validation goes, we have this long history of validation for complex flow phenomena, consistently performing very well for turbulence in particular in these international blind benchmarks. The models we've introduced are widely applicable to a broad range of applications. We're showing everything for nuclear energy. There's also quite a bit of work being done. I know NREL uses it for wind turbines and airfoil design. There's a group in Florida that's using it for ocean flows. And there's quite a bit of work being done in a bunch of different fields. So we want to leverage the capabilities that we have and the available expertise to be useful, usable, and used. It's something to look forward to. There's additional collaborations through the NRIC virtual testbed that will make the code more accessible to users in general, both in the industry and for regulators. So there will be a set of tutorial cases that are made available to anyone that's interested in them. So in conclusion, it's a high fidelity CFD tool. These are important for the nuclear industry just because of the wide range of problems that we come up against. We have the accuracy and speed of spectral elements combined with the flexibility of the finite element method. It's highly scalable, so you can use it for problems of all sizes. Again, I mentioned you can download this and run it on your laptop, or you can deploy it on the fastest supercomputers available in the world. The models that we have make it broadly applicable, and we're constantly under development, so there are new capabilities that are being added. If there's anything in particular that we have an interested stakeholder has expressed interest in, then we tend to get those capabilities developed as quickly as we can. It's open source, which makes it very easy to distribute. You can go on to this URL and download it today. And we have decades of ongoing validation efforts just to underline the accuracy of these high fidelity results. And so with that, thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaver. I think that was an excellent presentation. I hope many of your audience developed some interest in this type of thermohydraulics problems. This is very nice selection. So, Steve, do you have anything in the room?
No, we don't have any questions in the room.
I'm looking at the chat. So if anyone who is connected online would like to ask a question, feel free either to type it in the chat or even, raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask it directly. While we're waiting, so one of you, we have something. So Patrick is asking, could you define the term you used, hero class calculation?
This is kind of my own personal term. It basically refers to any sort of simulation that uses a huge amount of computing capability. These are the sort of simulations that the leadership facilities are looking for, so ALCF and OLCF, to, I don't want to put it in quite these terms, but basically justify their existence. The ones I referenced specifically were for the full core SMR and the full core pebble beds. Something that dims the lights, yes, effectively. It uses more or less the entire capability of the machine. So one part about one part of this is building these large computers is you can have a lot of people running a lot of small problems simultaneously, but the real attraction in it is being able to run larger and larger cases, just to see how these integral effects or these, something, you get the real details of the full core when you can do the full core simulation.
But if I may add, I think, as you say, justify the existence. You could build a bunch of small computers and solve those smaller problems, right?
Yes.
But to justify the investment into large supercomputers, you should be able to solve problems which you wouldn't be able to solve, in any other way, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's what we and this hero, I think June mentioning about more than 10 billion points, degrees of freedoms now. But I think this hero calculation is a sort of a function of time, right?
Yes.
And I think that's what we mentioned, right? What was hero 10 years or 5 years ago is not hero anymore, right?
It was hero 10 years ago. Today, it's a Tuesday.
Yeah.
June is saying 10 billion degrees of freedom. I think even 10 billion is pretty routine these days. Dare I say,
but I think a big challenge, I'm trying to remember if June mentioned in his presentation or you mentioned it now, is the time evolution, right? Resolving the long time transients. I think that's what is a major challenge as well.
And there's a couple of aspects to that, and there's, for evaluating time transients, you want strong scaling. And we were doing really well on that in the CPU era. In the GPU era, we're still doing pretty well on strong scaling, but now we're really excelling in terms of weak scaling. So that's larger problems are running for basically the same amount of time.
Yeah, but still, I think even with strong scaling, you cannot put half an element per core, right? There are still some problems which, I see Naveen raised a hand. Naveen, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Thanks for the broad array of simulations there, Dillon. I have a question about, I have a couple of questions. So one's about your Moose equivalent or your wrapper. And that's how do you have any quantifiable differences between running your normal neck, say, and then neck under the Moose framework? Is there any difference at all?
So if you're running a standalone neck calculation, there's no difference at all. Once you
Okay.
start incorporating the models for moose, then your bottleneck becomes how well moose scales.
Yeah.
As long as you're asking it to do something simple, like we've done, I think we've done heat transfer in those pebble beds, and it scales pretty well. Haven't quite pushed it all the way to what we've done as a standalone fluid calculation. I think we've done on the order of 100,000 pebbles in that case.
Okay, cool. But if it was, say, this picture here and you ran this simulation, it would be like 100% identical using
Yes.
moose. Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And then the other question I have is how is, if any, have the development of two-phase capabilities in NEC been going?
Recently, they haven't, frankly. These were important a few years ago, but now as the focus from the industry and the regulator perspective is based on these advanced reactor designs, principally MSRs and sodium fast reactors in which two-phase flow is not a concern. It just hasn't been a programmatic priority. That could change overnight though. Who knows?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this is yeah. The hope is that it will be more interesting to phase flow, obviously, based on my research interest for sure, and even for advanced design. I mean, yes, there are normal conditions and there are abnormal conditions, right? So
yes.
So I guess we design process for advanced reactors and not at this stage into looking into any sort of severe accidents yet, right?
Correct. And I think two-phase flow will probably play a prominent role in MSR design, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that would be interesting, especially from simulation perspective, obviously, because experiments are important, right? But the role of experiments is very important, but advanced simulations may be very helpful there as well.
Exactly.
Thank you. All right, Naveen still has your hand up, but I assume it's a leftover, right?
Oh yeah.
I got a quick question, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
So great talk. I was curious. We played around with NEC 5000 a few years ago, trying to use the magnetohydrodynamic module. The way, if I recall, the way it was set up previously was that you could impose an external field, but you could not calculate perturbations in the field generated by, say, turbulence in a conducting fluid. Is that still the case, or do you have it set up so that it couples back into some sort of electromagnetic solver?
I'm going to tell you, I don't know much about the magnetohydrodynamic solve in NEC. It's part of the code that I haven't ever touched. I would have to imagine it's coupled back. A colleague of mine was the lead developer for that aspect of it, and they've been interested in doing some simulations of basically the Earth's core, which are extremely high Reynolds numbers. So I have to imagine there's some sort of capability to feed those back together, but I can't be certain. And I unfortunately can't give you a direct answer. But I can put you in touch with someone who would know.
So if there's any interest, it might be a capability that's coming up in Moose, where if the wrap worked in Moose for that, you might be able to get coupling through there.
Yes, that's as part of the wrapper that we're developing. Anything that is available in Moose, you should be able to get those directly into NEC.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I presume in the in-person room there are any additional questions potentially?
There are no hands up. I think the room is happy.
All right. Anyone has any other questions who is online? So Dillon, I was thinking you mentioned something about NEC2P, right?
Mm-hmm.
In one of the slides. Could you go back there?
Sure. Let's see, where is it? Zooms in my way.
Also, this was on the okay, on the boiling flow actually. Okay.
Yes.
So the model which you implemented back then, well, I learned multi-phase, right? And we've actually heat transfer as well.
Yes.
All right. No, that's very nice. So that's kind of I guess potentially thinking about future developments, you know, well, given two-phase finding availability as always. Would you imagine, because you have a sort of a there was some work done on the, you know, interface capturing, and I know it's kind of very preliminary, but let's imagine that it's all working. So would you imagine that it would be possible to do the sort of multi-scale modeling within NEC, you know, with both interface capturing and LR and multi-phase at some point, maybe in the far future, you know, before you retire?
Before I retire, that's putting a lot of restrictions on it. Yeah, I imagine that would be possible. So the first step we need to do is the multi-phase capability here was never incorporated into the main code. So this right here is now 3 or 4 years old. June has used it more recently, so we know it still does work, but there's quite a bit of legwork to be done to get this in. You're aware of the interface capturing methods. I believe right now we're pending on a journal publication for that one. Hopefully that will be coming out soon. But I've sort of distracted Nadish with other things.
Okay. Yeah, but that kind of circles back to my you know, time scale concerns, right? So one of the you may be aware, right? One of the Castle the project which ended a few years ago, challenge problem was about CRUD formation, right? And so you're thinking about 18 months at least, you know, refueling cycle, right? Versus micro or milliseconds of bubble nucleation and boiling. And obviously, you know, if you want to nucleate all those bubbles all the 18 months, no amount of strong scaling will help you, right?
Yeah, it's not going to get you there. I think the best hope for that would be, there was some talk about getting multi-phase models implemented in SAM, and we would end up with the fully coupled capability through Cardinal and Moose. What that actually looks like, I don't know, but I think that's the best hope for doing a calculation like that.
Yeah, I know this would be some sort of a mid to long term, right? Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Any other questions before we adjourn? And I think Dr. Shaver had his email information if anyone wants to kind of get in touch with him. I guess he would be open to. Okay, so there is a question. Okay, from my student Kai. So with high fidelity data being generated in an unprecedented rate, are there plans to effectively leverage those data for future NEC development? NEC development or model development, I guess. I don't know if Kai wants to speak up to clarify a little bit, because
there are lots of plans to leverage the high fidelity data that we're generating with NEC to develop the other NEAMS tools, particularly Pronghorn, SAM come to mind for that. If I interpret high fidelity data to also include high fidelity experimental data, then absolutely. We're always interested in validation. You know, in terms of generating new capabilities, we're also doing quite a bit of work in the RANS modeling area. And we're using the high fidelity data to inform that development as well. So there are definitely plans, and there are quite a few different pathways for that. How that crystallizes will be interesting to see in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I guess we have no questions. Any parting thoughts, Dillon, before we adjourn?
No, that pretty much covers it. Just I'm excited to see that we're getting more and more students that are well versed in CFD coming out of the universities these days. That makes my job a lot easier.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, the more funding we get, the more students will progress.
All for
All
that.
right. Thank you very much, and it was excellent talk. I think it was very educational, and I hope, yeah, if we did have any students, undecided students in the audience, that maybe they will start thinking about high fidelity simulations as a part of their research. All right. Thanks again. Thank everyone for attending. Dillon, I appreciate your time. Hopefully, we'll make it in person, maybe a couple of years down the line when we are past all these those restrictions. We'll be looking forward to host you at NC State in person. That would be great.
That'd be great.
Thanks a lot, and have a nice evening, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you for your attention.